A straightforward trip takes an unexpected detour, exposing a startling tale of bias and presumption. What occurs when a person is mistreated by an airline hostess and his true identity is revealed? Join us as we tell you a story that will astound you. In a world where looks can be misleading, one man's calm and quiet strength reveals a harsh reality, and an unexpected truth changes everything. The flight was like any other. Passengers were settling into their seats as the air hostess, a woman in her early 30s, walked effortlessly down the aisle. She was confident, well-groomed, and carried herself with a sense of superiority. Her smile was polite, but there was something about her that suggested she felt superior to everyone else. A black man sat peacefully in first class. He was well dressed and maintained a cool and composed appearance. His eyes appeared to tell a narrative, but he talked nothing and kept to himself. He gazed out the window as the jet began to taxi down the runway, his demeanor placid and unreadable. He was walked past by the air hostess, who glanced at him for a moment before moving on to the next traveler without hesitation. No extra attention or special welcome was given. Just a quick look, then a blank stare. She had no idea that this would be the beginning of a meeting that would make her doubt everything she thought she knew. A model of professionalism, the flight hostess was. Her uniform was neat and in its proper position, and she moved with purpose. She greeted each passenger with a smile that appeared a bit too scripted, and her movements were fluid, almost polished. Her head was held high, her body was straight, and she exuded a serene confidence that gave the impression that she was in charge of the circumstance. However, there was more going on behind the surface. A faint sense of superiority that she made no effort to conceal. It was in the way she regarded others, particularly those she considered less significant, rather than in what she said. When she looked around at the other passengers, there was a certain coldness in her eyes, as though she thought she was superior to them. Her body language spoke for itself. She didn't have to say anything. She was the one in command, and this flight seemed like any other. Sitting peacefully in his chair, the black man maintained a relaxed yet attentive stance. His suit was immaculately pressed, his tie was fastened, and he was nicely dressed. He exuded a calm assurance, as though he didn't have to prove anything to anyone. His serene manner contrasted sharply with the typical commotion of a packed flight. But there was a mystery in his gaze. They were intent but aloof, as though he was deep in contemplation, or perhaps quietly taking in the world. He kept to himself and didn't interact with others, but there was something about him that seemed to attract notice. Even though he didn't say much, he was definitely there. The man was a mystery. He was cool, collected, and exuded a sense of mystery that left you wondering what tale he was concealing. The plane's environment was normal for a flight in the middle of the morning. A quiet murmur was produced by the gentle talk of passengers settling in and the background hum of the engines. While checking seatbelts and providing pre-flight refreshments, the flight attendants hurried down the aisles. The air was heavy with the aroma of freshly opened snack bags and coffee. There was a subtle tension in the scenario despite its routineness. While some passengers fidgeted with their phones, anticipating the flight to take off, others looked at their watches, eager to settle in. The air hostess appeared to be oblivious to the little change in tone as she moved with practiced precision. Her attention was on her responsibilities, and she looked about the cabin with professional yet slightly critical gaze, as though she were evaluating the passengers to see who was worthy of her time and who wasn't. But the first-class chap sat quite comfortably, as though he were in a whole different universe. His serenity stood in stark contrast to the quiet buzz of activity all around him. Unbeknownst to most, the strain in the air hung between the passengers like an unseen thread, just waiting to break. The commotion of travelers getting on the aircraft was nothing new. A steady stream of people, carrying carry-ons and chatting eagerly, went forward as the gate opened. The gentle announcements above blended with the sound of moving baggage wheels on the airport floor. While some travelers appeared to take their time, dragging their feet as they looked for space in the overhead bins, others hurried, eager to locate their seats. There were tourists taking out their phones to record the scene, entrepreneurs working on laptops, and families with little children. The shuffling of shoes on the carpeted floor, the sound of last-minute chats, and the occasional burst of laughter filled the air. The air hostess waited at the doorway, smiling courteously as she greeted each traveler and swiftly looked over the boarding credentials. As she led people down the aisle, her motions were smooth, almost robotic. The passengers, each with their own tales and destinations, continued to stream in, filling the plane with a mixture of expectation, frustration, and excitement, while the cabin staff worked on their own jobs in preparation for takeoff. The air hostess stood close to the entrance, her eyes scanning each passenger as they went down the aisle with meticulous practice. Despite her kind smile, she didn't bother to conceal the coolness and subtle judgment in her eyes. Quickly, as if assessing each individual, she determined who was worthy of her undivided attention and who could be set aside. Some of the passengers caught her attention. They were well-dressed and appeared to belong in first class. A more focused greeting, a small nod of approval. However, her grin appeared somewhat colder to others, particularly those she considered unfit. As she gave them their boarding cards, her eyes hardly touched theirs, and she hurried away without giving them another look. Although it wasn't obvious, she had an implicit hierarchy in her head. It was evident from her movements and facial expressions that she didn't need to say anything. She seemed to feel that she belonged to a higher social level, and that the other passengers were merely occupying the seats and not nearly deserving of her undivided attention. The anxiety in the cabin gradually increased as the plane filled up. Even while the air hostess was still making rounds, checking seat belts and serving drinks, her movements had changed. She moved more quickly and engaged in shorter conversations. She appeared more attentive, almost tense. The atmosphere had changed, but the black man remained serene and sat quietly in his seat. The air hostess appeared to take longer than necessary as she passed him once more. She looked at him again, her gaze lingering, a minute too long. She made some adjustments to her costume, making her movements somewhat more precise and her smile less sincere. Sensing the shift in the air, a few passengers looked at one another. Though no one dared to talk too loudly, whispers started to circulate. Unspoken uneasiness seemed to permeate the cabin, drowning out the buzz of the plane's engines and other passengers' conversations. Although the black man remained silent, the tension was evident. Everyone in the cabin seemed to sense the tension rising and waited for something to happen. Unaware of the commotion she was about to cause, the air hostess carried on with her rounds, but her gaze never left him. As the air hostess passed by, the black man, who remained serene and calm, lifted his hand softly. He said in a smooth, gentle, and courteous manner, "Pardon me, could you please assist me with my seat? It isn't adapting correctly." The flight hostess hesitated, her gaze briefly locking with his. Her visage briefly flashed annoyance, but she swiftly covered it up with a tight smile. She nodded without saying anything and walked toward him, a little faster than previously. To adjust the seat, she bent over, but her motions were rigid, almost robotic. Her behaviors lacked any warmth or sincere concern. For a few minutes, she tinkled with the seat, her fingers swift and keen, as though she were doing him a favor instead of carrying out her obligation. Her words were cold. "That should be fine," without even looking up at him. The black man's voice remained composed as he nodded in appreciation. "Thank you." However, the air hostess remained silent. She just stood up and went on, her eyes already turning to the next traveler. Although she was unaware of it, everyone else could feel the tension in the air after the prejudice. Cushion. With a calm, indifferent attitude, the air hostess got up from adjusting the seat. Her eyes flickered impatiently for a time as she looked at the black man. Her tone was abrasive and contemptuous, as though she were doing him a favor by lending a hand. "There, that should be fine," she replied. She turned to attend to the next passenger without waiting for his response. She moved quickly, like though she was eager to get rid of him. She said, curtly, "Next," without a smile or affection. Still composed, the black man leaned back in his chair and felt the coolness of her. Her response to his courteous request for assistance had been anything but kind. However, he kept it to himself. He just gave himself a nod, allowing the time to pass. But as soon as it had arrived, the air hostess's focus had already shifted to her next assignment, despite being largely preoccupied with their own tasks. The other passengers were unable to ignore the conversation. A few eyebrows went lifted, and two strangers exchanged uncomfortable looks. Sensing the slight tension in the air, some people moved in their seats, but the majority decided to ignore it and act as though they were blind to what had just happened. In a low but distinct voice, a woman seated in the row across from the black man murmured to her friend, "Did you see that?" She hardly assisted him at all. Her friend gave her a nod, but they remained silent. The air hostess gave him a disdainful look as a man in the first row, who had been reading his newspaper, looked over the top of it. He scowled, obviously uneasy, but soon returned to his reading, so as not to become involved. A senior citizen seated close to the rear saw the exchange with subdued disgust. He gave a small shake of his head, as though he sensed something wasn't quite right, but wasn't sure how to handle it. There was a pervasive sense of unease in the cabin. The frigid treatment of the air hostess was starting to get noticed, but nobody voiced their disapproval. Even though the tension was obvious, it seemed that everyone was prevented from confronting it head-on by the unwritten code of civility. But the black man was unfazed, his serene demeanor standing in stark contrast to the growing unease around him. The cabin appeared to hold its breath as the air hostess continued. The passengers looked at each other uneasily, but nobody ventured to raise their voices. Some squirmed uneasily in their seats, not knowing how to respond, while others pretended not to see, looking down at their laps. A young woman seated next to the aisle gave the black man a confused look. Her mouth opened as though to speak, but she quickly shut it and turned her head away. As everyone in the cabin felt the weight of the awkward situation, but wasn't sure if it was their place to speak, the quiet got thicker. A few rows behind the black man, a middle-aged man noticed the expression in the air hostess's eyes as she passed him. He scowled before glancing around the cabin and looking into the eyes of several other travelers. None of them was pleased by what had just transpired, but they were all uncertain of how to react. So they exchanged quick, wordless acknowledgments. There was a noticeable tension. No one was eager to speak up, even though it seemed like the entire cabin had noticed the disrespect. Rather, everyone remained silent in the hopes that the time would pass. However, like an unspoken fact, it hung in the air. Leaning down toward her tiny child, who was playing quietly with a toy in her lap, was a woman seated a few rows ahead of the black man. Even though her voice was hardly audible above a whisper, it was obvious that she was uncomfortable. As she walked down the aisle, she glanced at the air hostess and whispered, "Did you see how she treated him? That wasn't very nice, was it?" Wide-eyed, the toddler gazed up at her mother, feeling the shift in the air, but not quite comprehending what had just transpired. However, she nodded, sensing her mother's discomfort. As she fastened her child's seatbelt, the mother shook her head and let out a soft sigh. After glancing at the black man, who remained composed and serene, she turned back to the air hostess, who was now occupied with other travelers. Her face tensed in silent annoyance, but she remained silent and kept her feelings to herself. Though brief, the moment conveyed a lot. Even though she remained silent, the mother's uneasiness was clear. She had seen the disrespect. Though too young to properly comprehend the circumstances, the infant could nevertheless sense the tension in the air and would eventually realize how important the occasion was. After a few minutes, the air hostess hurried down the aisle and brought a tray of drinks back to the front of the cabin. "What would you like to drink?" she said mechanically, pausing at the black man's seat and glancing at him for a moment. Although she still spoke in a harsh tone, there was trace of forced professionalism as she attempted to hide the stress from the previous exchange. Still unaffected, the black man gazed up at her calmly. "Please, I'll have some water," he said courteously. With a nod, the air hostess snatched a bottle of water from the trolley, her actions swift and precise. She gave it to him without looking at him, her fingers softly touching his. Even though it was only a moment, her gesture was clearly frigid. With her voice still cold, she said, "Here," and then, without saying another word, she went on to the next traveler. As she left, the black man quietly said, "Thank you," and accepted the water. The passengers surrounding him sensed a slight change in the atmosphere, but he didn't let the interaction affect him. The majority of passengers remained silent, but the uneasiness in the cabin was increasing as the air hostess's contemptuous demeanor became more apparent. The cabin fell into a peaceful rhythm as the flight went on. The buzz of the engines provided a steady background as passengers read peacefully or fell asleep. The black man eventually pushed the call button above his seat with a gentle touch. Looking up, the air hostess who had been pacing the aisles noticed the light. She sighed and approached him, that tinge of impatience still visible in her face. "Yes?" she inquired, trying to seem professional while maintaining a harsh tone. The black man said, "I'd like a glass of water, please," in his usual composed and courteous tone. The air hostess took a while to reply. After a brief pause, during which her eyes swept over him, she gave a short nod. With a clipped voice, she added, "I'll bring it right over," before turning to go to the next task. Even though it was a straightforward request, her response was anything but kind. The black man leaned back in his seat, unaffected as she left, but the other passengers couldn't help but feel the slight tension rising once more. Now carrying snacks and drinks in her cart, the air hostess proceeded down the aisle. She didn't pause as she went by the black man's seat, glancing at him for a moment before moving on. A couple of well-dressed passengers were sitting a few rows ahead when she stopped and gave them a warm, sincere smile. Her voice immediately became friendlier and warmer as she inquired, "What can I get for you?" As if they were old friends, she handed them their drinks with ease and engaged them in brief conversation. Her manner was definitely different. Her tone was light and accommodating, and the smile on her face was sincere. She then proceeded to the next traveler, treating them with the same promptness, efficiency, and courtesy. Still sitting quietly, the black man observed the conversation. The air hostess was taking her time, serving others before him, as though his request for water didn't really matter. In sharp contrast to how she had treated him before, she hurried down the aisle, putting everyone else before herself. The other passengers around him were aware of it. Some noticed the wait and looked up, but nobody spoke, as though everyone was waiting for something to break the silence. The tension in the air increased, but the black guy was patient, his manner unaltered, and the air hostess kept smiling as she served others, her tardiness in helping him becoming increasingly noticeable. The air hostess eventually made her way back to the black man's seat with the glass of water in her hand after what seemed like an age. With a narrow, tight-lipped face in place of her once bright smile, she paused before him. Her eyes met his for the first time since he had asked, and she gave him the glass in a swift, almost contemptuous gesture. "Here you go," she remarked in a clipped, piercing voice. "Be patient the next time." Her remarks, each with a faint but indisputable edge, lingered in the atmosphere. The black man accepted the glass silently, his composure unflinching, but everyone around him could feel the pain of her remark. She turned on her heel and walked away without even waiting for him to answer, immediately concentrating on the next traveler. Although there was silence in the cabin, the anxiety was at an all-time high. The other travelers, who had been silently watching the conversation, shifted uneasily in their chairs. No one raised their voice, although some glanced at the air hostess, some at the black man. The effect of the moment was dense and indisputable, but it went swiftly. The flight hostess spoke something sharp, but the black man, who was still holding the glass of water, didn't flinch. He sipped slowly while maintaining a steady, composed stare. His reaction, or rather the fact that he didn't respond, was quite telling. His quiet was strong enough on its own, even though he didn't respond with rage or irritation. Although he could feel the passengers' gazes on him, he maintained his composure and maintained a neutral demeanor. He didn't have to make a fuss or raise his voice. He decided to let his calm dignity do the talking instead. He had been treated disrespectfully, he had waited patiently, and he had asked nicely. He wasn't going to be shaken by it, though. With deliberate and controlled movements, he set the glass down on the tray table. His reaction was the epitome of poise under duress. No confrontation, no wares, just the silent power of a man who understood his value, no matter how others treated him. Now preoccupied with other travelers, the air hostess failed to recognize the impact of her remarks. For the black man, however, the moment was over. His response, which left the air heavy with unsaid knowledge, had been composed and quiet. He remained unfazed by the tension in the cabin, and his silent resistance was stronger than any words could have been. The black man, whose coolness never faltered, took a deep breath as the air hostess left with her back to him. His gaze shifted from her retreating form to the glass of water he was holding. He called out to her in a low voice, devoid of any trace of resentment or rage. He murmured, "Thank you," in a steady voice that was almost faint enough for her to hear. The hostess didn't look back. The words lingered in the air, deliberate and clear. But she didn't recognize him. Even in the face of her disdain, his thank you was a straightforward, silent expression of respect rather than a sign of surrender or defeat. He didn't have to give an explanation. He didn't have to get more combative or agitated. His appreciation was sincere, but it also had a tone of dignity and firmness that she had obviously misjudged. Even though the moment was past, his response's significance persisted, serving as a silent witness to his character. The weight of the interaction was felt by the other passengers who had been observing it. All were aware of the subdued strength in his comments, while some were moved and others uneasy. His graceful handling of the matter demonstrated that sometimes the most effective response is the one that doesn't even need a response. The air hostess's irritation appeared to increase with every second as the black man sat back in his seat, his composed manner unflinching. Her eyes darted over the people with a little annoyance as she walked around the cabin with sharp, fast feet. Her smile had vanished entirely, replaced by a taut, contorted face that only became more noticeable as she went about her work. She would occasionally turn to face the black man again, her eyes staying on him for a fraction of a second longer than was required. She seemed to be attempting to persuade herself that she had done enough and that her actions were appropriate. The tension that was gradually growing around her, however, could not be concealed. In the meantime, the black man maintained his composure, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his posture relaxed. He didn't offer her the satisfaction of a response or acknowledge her. His composure stood in sharp contrast to her mounting annoyance, which only served to increase the tension in the room. Around them, other passengers sensed the change. Sensing the tension between the two, several glanced at each other quickly and uneasily. The air hostess, whose movements had become more rigid, attempted to keep up her professional demeanor, but it was obvious that she was uncomfortable with the black man's silent might. She was baffled as to why he wasn't acting in the manner she had anticipated, why he wasn't upset or creating a scene. Although she was clearly frustrated, it simply served to highlight the black man's composure. What appeared to frighten her the most was that he wasn't concerned by her. The tension in the cabin only increased as a result of the contrast between their two reactions, her increasing irritation and his calm silence. The air hostess appeared to become increasingly irritated as the flight went on. Unable to get rid of the lingering uneasiness, she hurried up and down the aisle, but her gaze kept returning to the black man. She was unable to fully comprehend the peace he emanated, and it only served to increase her impatience. At last, her steps faltered as she walked past his seat again. She came to a halt before him, her voice icy and her face taut. Her tone was abrasive and accusing as she stated, "You're making this difficult for everyone. You've been nothing but trouble since we boarded, despite my best efforts to do my job." The peaceful hum of the cabin was abruptly broken by the force of the words. Around them, other passengers froze, turning to watch the conversation. The black man's eyes flickered with surprise as he peered up at her, but his face remained composed. He hadn't done anything to merit such an accusation, nor had he spoken anything to incite this. She went on, raising her voice a little. "I'm just trying to do my job, but I don't know what your problem is. Perhaps you ought to quit making things so hard for me." Her comments oozed a thinly veiled animosity, and her tone was caustic. The black man, who was still seated, listened to her statements for a while without saying anything. The air was heavy with expectancy, and the folks around them were nervous. Obviously, something had changed. Already uneasy, the atmosphere now had an unmistakable strain to it. Even though the charge was baseless and unfair, the black man's composed manner did not alter. She provoked him, but he didn't respond. Rather, he just stared at her, his eyes unblinking and steady, as though he were asking her to think twice about what she had said. The stillness between them dragged on, getting heavier by the second. A sharp wave of turbulence jolted the jet as the air hostess stood there, her words lingering in the air. Unease crept across the aisles when the plane dipped slightly, causing the cabin to rattle and passengers to gasp. The briefcase that the black man had been carrying at his feet moved in the turmoil. The clasps holding it closed snapped open when it tipped over slightly. Papers flew out, splattering on the floor and across the seat. Everyone's attention was drawn to the briefcase's contents, even as the sound of rustling papers filled the room. Some of the papers fell with their edges visible to others around them as they spread. There was no mistaking the words on the top sheet. Classified. The documents had prominent markings that screamed secrecy, emblazoned in enormous red characters. When the other passengers realized what they were seeing, they froze and their eyes widened. The hostess, who had been standing a few feet away, stepped back, the color fading from her face. Her expression changed from annoyance to horror as her gaze flitted to the paperwork and then back to the man. The only sounds in the cabin for a moment were the plane's hum and the slight rustle of the papers that were still on the floor. As though nothing unusual had just occurred, the black man stooped down and collected the documents with careful care, moving slowly and deliberately. There was a new level of anxiety in the cabin. As the situation's reality set in, the accusation and the icy treatment all appeared to vanish into the background. The passengers, who had been uneasy during the previous interaction, were now uncertain of how to respond. What had they just seen? In reality, who was this man? What were the meanings of these documents? As the black guy closed his briefcase, the air hostess remained motionless, watched as his composed manner returned as though nothing had changed. However, there was an irreversible change in the cabin's environment. Now more than ever, the tension that had been developing during the journey was evident. The black man was much more significant than anyone had thought. He wasn't simply any traveler. The air hostess stood motionless for a while, taking in what she had just witnessed, her face still pallid from the sight of the secret documents. Her gaze returned to the black man, who was carefully gathering up the strewn papers, his face unflappable, as if this were a trivial annoyance, but her thoughts were racing. It was difficult to overlook the documents, those red classified marks. She had heard enough tales and watched enough films to understand what that meant. She immediately started to make connections between the man's enigmatic manner, his composure in the face of her previous animosity, and now the papers that had leaked out of his briefcase. Her mind started to wander. What if he has something hazardous on him? She pondered. What if such documents are sensitive in addition to being classified? What happens if he is not who he claims to be? Her initial uneasiness evolved into suspicion, and her mind began to construct a story that explained her uneasiness. An acute edge of paranoia was replacing the sense of dominance she had already experienced over him. He's concealing something. He is not your typical traveler. The air hostess stepped back, her fingers quivering slightly as she reached for the intercom button. She was unsure of what to do, but the suspicion that was eating away at her got stronger by the moment. She looked around at the other travelers, some of whom were still observing the black man with puzzled and uncomfortable looks on their faces. She turned back to face the man, who was now sitting back in his seat with his briefcase closed, utterly oblivious to the tempest that was building inside her head. She thought, what if he's not just another passenger? And her breath caught. Can it be that he is something far more dangerous? As she struggled with her own thoughts, the tension in the cabin appeared to increase. As she attempted to solve the puzzle, she continued to stare at him for a minute longer, her skepticism growing. She had no idea what was going on, but she was positive that the man was not your typical traveler, and that something about him seemed really, really off. Still shaken by the sight of the confidential materials, the flight hostess was unable to shake the developing suspicion. She knew she couldn't ignore what she'd seen, but her mind was racing with questions and concerns. Once more, she looked about the cabin, her gaze flitting from the black man to the other travelers, who were still chatting among themselves and clearly uncomfortable. The documents he had been carrying simply added to the mystery, and the man was almost too calm. Without hesitation, she inhaled deeply and made her way stealthily to the cockpit. She walked quickly, but as she got closer to the door, she made an effort to remain calm. When she heard the pilot's voice calling her inside, she knocked gently and went inside. The pilot's voice was firm as he inquired, "Is everything all right?" But his eyes showed a trace of concern when he noticed the expression on her face. She paused, looking over her shoulder to be sure no one was observing. Then she leaned toward the pilot and whispered. She stated in a scarcely audible voice, "I think we need to contact security when we land. One of the passengers is acting strangely. There are classified documents in his possession. I believe he is concealing something. As soon as we land, we should notify the authorities." The pilot's demeanor changed to one of concern as he raised an eyebrow. "Documents that are classified? Are you certain?" Her eyes were wide with a mixture of mistrust and terror as she nodded. "I personally witnessed them. All over them were red classified stamps. He's no ordinary traveler. We can't take any chances, but I'm not sure what he's up to." The pilot took a moment to consider what she had said. He could hear the anxiety suddenly seeping into her tone, the urgency in her voice. He paused for a long moment before nodding. "All right," he murmured in a quiet, low voice, yet there was a noticeable air of authority. "I'll remember that. When we land, security will be waiting for him." Relieved that the pilot was paying attention, the air hostess nodded quickly. A shiver went down her spine as she turned to go. The feeling that something wasn't right was unavoidable. Even if she wasn't sure if she was exaggerating or if the man actually posed a threat. The tension in the cabin appeared to rise as she went back to work, with her mind racing with ideas of what would happen after they arrived. The air hostess moved swiftly. She couldn't get rid of the persistent thought that the man's genuine identity was much more deadly than everyone had thought. The air hostess's suspicions increased with each minute of the journey. The scene where the black man's briefcase opened and the confidential documents fell out was replayed in her thoughts. All she could do now was wait for the jet to land, as she had already warned the captain. However, the anxiety increased as the minutes passed. The black man was still sitting quietly in his seat when the air hostess walked down the aisle once more, her gaze lingering on him. His composure only strengthened her suspicions because he appeared utterly oblivious to the tempest that was building all around him. At last, the air hostess was unable to contain herself as the jet started to descend. She came to a stop in front of his seat, her face now displaying a mixture of caution and resolve. Their eyes darted anxiously between the two as the other passengers realized something was about to happen. "I need to talk to you," she added, her voice colder than before. A glimmer of recognition appeared in the black man's eyes as he gazed up at her, his face remaining composed. He had noticed a change in the atmosphere, the way the passengers were observing, and the tone of the air hostess. However, he remained silent and waited for her to go on. With a forceful yet hushed voice, she added, "I know what you're carrying. Those records, surely they are classified." The black man's eyes remained fixed. He didn't recoil or react right away. His quiet said more than words as he simply gazed at her. The hostess of the air narrowed her eyes. "What do you conceal? Really, who are you?" The question was laden with accusations and hovered in the air. She was demanding explanations for her presumptions. However, the black man didn't respond as she had anticipated. He didn't try to defend himself or get defensive. Rather, he just sat there, his coolness unfazed. For the air hostess, a few seconds seemed like an eternity. Passengers surrounding them were now holding their breath in anticipation as they watched closely. The quiet between them was deafening and the tension was heavy. The black man finally spoke, his tone steady and composed. He broke the tension with the words, "You're wrong. I'm not who you believe me to be." The air hostess's eyes widened, but before she could react, the man took a little unmarked card out of his jacket pocket. Without saying anything, he gave it to her. As she read the words inscribed on the card, FBI Special Agent, her fingers trembled a little. The understanding hit her like a kick to the stomach, causing her breath to catch in her throat. The man had been defending them all along, so he wasn't a threat. With the flight hostess standing there, immobilized, processing the reality, the tension in the cabin suddenly changed. She had assumed the worst, accused him, and passed judgment on him. Now, however, all she could do was stand in startled silence in the face of this information. The reality was revealed to the passengers in a way that none of them had anticipated, leaving them all stunned. The black man maintained his composed manner, but there was a glimmer of something more profound in his eyes now, something that suggested the gravity of the duty he bore. He wasn't merely a traveler. He had a purpose. The flight hostess had only had a minor role in it. Even though the altercation was over, the effects of the incident would last long after the plane landed. The air hostess's mounting annoyance finally erupted as the aircraft descended further. Having already formed her presumptions, she was now prepared to face the man in public, driven by a mixture of pride and distrust. He was out of place in first class, and she was going to make it plain because her thinking had already convinced her of that. Standing erect and with a hard posture, she approached his seat. There was an uncomfortable stillness among the other passengers who sensed that something was about to happen. The air hostess's stern, accusing glare was fixed on the black man. "You know," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear, "I've been observing you ever since we got on board. You have no place here." Her tone had an unmistakable edge, and the words were incisive. Even though he was still calm, the black man's eyes flashed with astonishment as he peered up at her. This type of confrontation, not in public, was not what he had anticipated. However, he remained silent, allowing her to go on. With an air of contempt, she went on, "You're in first class, but you don't look like you belong here. You don't have the same attire as the other travelers. You don't behave like them. You're obviously out of place, but I'm not sure what type of game you're playing." As the other passengers shuffled uneasily in their seats, the tension in the cabin increased as her comments lingered in the air. While some looked at each other, others gazed at the sight in front of them. The flight hostess had been unambiguous in her accusation. This man didn't belong in first class, in her opinion. The black man said nothing, his coolness unfazed. His eyes never left hers, yet they were devoid of rage and resentment, simply silent power. Even though he didn't answer her questions, his very presence seemed to contradict her presumptions. With an increasingly acerbic tone, she continued, "You've been acting like you're above everyone else. However, I see right through you. Nobody is fooled by you." The air was heavy with discomfort as the other passengers looked on. The air hostess had gone too far, and it was now obvious that she wasn't just doubting his identity, but also his legitimacy for being in that location. She had made the public decision that he wasn't fit for first class. Nevertheless, the black man remained silent. He just sat there, gaze steady, stance calm. The strongest answer he could give was to remain silent. But the air hostess appeared increasingly upset, her statements becoming more accusatory by the moment. Her voice was now loud enough for the entire cabin to hear her say, "Perhaps you should return to your seat in economy. Someone like you has no place here." The words were a last jab, a challenge. Now the other passengers were holding their breath, anticipating a response. Would he protect himself? Would he protest? Would he rise and go? The black man, however, stayed motionless, his serene demeanor nearly defying her. The tension in the cabin had already peaked, but the confrontation was far from over. The air hostess stood over the black man, her eyes narrowing with a sense of superiority, and her voice rang out, cutting and piercing. The claim was being made in public, and she was no longer merely addressing him in private. With a tone full of contempt, she questioned, "Are you sure you're in the right seat? Maybe you should be in economy." Her judgmental comments lingered in the air. They were surrounded by passengers who were shifting uneasily in their seats, some of them looking at each other suspiciously. By making her insinuation public and casting doubt on the man's identity, as well as his eligibility for first class, the air hostess had gone too far. The black man's face did not shift as he gazed up at her, his eyes steady and serene. He didn't recoil or respond to what she said. Instead, he relaxed his stance and sat back in his chair as if he had been expecting this. He remained silent. But the air hostess wasn't done yet. She was determined to make him feel insignificant in front of the entire cabin, since she had already made up her mind about him. Her voice carried the weight of her presumptions, and her words were sharp. She went on, her eyes icy. "You don't belong here. You're obviously out of place, and I'm not sure how you got a seat in first class." The cabin became increasingly tense. While some passengers were fixated on the confrontation playing out in front of them, others were clearly uneasy, their gazes flitting between the two. After the air hostess made her charges public, everyone was watching the black man to see how he would react. Nevertheless, he remained silent. He maintained his composure, his silence nearly deafening. The air hostess's mounting annoyance stood in sharp contrast to his composed manner. A flush of annoyance and conceit filled the air hostess's face. She found it incomprehensible that he wasn't responding to her or protecting himself. She had anticipated that he would defend himself and dispute, but instead he sat there in silence, seemingly unconcerned by her charges. They were now surrounded by nervous passengers who didn't know how this altercation would turn out. Would the man say anything at last? Is the air hostess going to back down? There was a noticeable sense of tension in the air, and the result of this encounter seemed unpredictable and up in the air. However, the black man's silence at that precise moment said more than words could. He didn't have to give an explanation. The air hostess's entire world was called into question by his mere presence. A thick stillness descended upon the passengers as the air hostess's words reverberated around the cabin. Everyone quickly realized that there was animosity in the air due to the obvious tension between her and the black man. The cabin erupted in gasps as everyone realized that this was no typical encounter. Uncertain of how to respond, some passengers shuffled uneasily in their chairs, their eyes darting tensely between the two. As the gravity of the situation set in, others spoke to one another and exchanged uncomfortable looks. It was obvious from the air hostess's acerbic remarks that she was criticizing the black man of not fitting in and being out of place in first class. A woman seated a few rows back, her expression displaying a mixture of worry and incredulity, gripped her child even more tightly. She couldn't help but feel nervous after hearing the air hostess's tone and the severity in her voice. As the tension increased, it became evident that this was something far more uncomfortable than the misunderstanding she had hoped it was. The black man was still composed, his face unreadable, his quiet disconcerting. He just sat there, commanding attention with his presence without uttering a word, not responding to the whispers or the gasps. But the flight hostess was becoming increasingly irritated. She had anticipated that he would defend himself and dispute, but he appeared totally unconcerned. He didn't rise to the bait. Even though her statements were intended to provoke him and make him defend his first-class status. Rather, the passengers were more conscious of the increasing animosity in the air, and the cabin became quieter. Across the aisle from the black man, a man shifted uneasily in his chair, a look of bewilderment and incredulity on his face. After observing the conversation, he was now left wondering why the air hostess had singled out this traveler. He had no idea what to make of it, but he knew that something wasn't quite right. As more travelers realized how serious the situation was, the gasps kept reverberating around the cabin. There was no denying the tension in the air now that the air hostess had gone too far. Will the black man speak up? Everyone was waiting for something to happen. Is the air hostess going to back down? Or would this awkward situation get worse? The once bustling cabin had gone strangely quiet, with the only sound being the plane's faint hum as it descended, and the air was heavy with expectancy. Now that the animosity was obvious, the passengers were left in startled silence, not knowing what would happen next. The black man finally spoke as the cabin echoed with whispers and gasps. His motions were steady and controlled as he calmly reached into his jacket pocket. Still towering over him, the flight hostess was observing intently, her face a mix of indignation and incredulity. She had accused him, and now she was waiting for an answer from him that would support her claims. However, rather than reacting defensively or angrily, the black man merely took a small, unmarked card out of his pocket. With his eyes fixed on the flight hostess and his face still composed, he put it out for her to see. The card was straightforward and businesslike. It was neither ostentatious nor unusual. However, the words printed on it were clear. Special Agent FBI breath, trapped in the air hostess's throat, her cheeks flushed with amazement and shame as she gazed at the badge, her eyes widening. She hadn't even thought about the prospect that this man might be someone significant, someone who had every right to be in first class because she had been so convinced of her presumptions and that he was out of place. The world seemed to pause for a second. Once tense and full of whispered conversations, the cabin suddenly became quiet. After witnessing the spectacle, the passengers now gazed in astonished astonishment. Nobody had anticipated this turn of events. The man's identity as an FBI agent was unexpected. With her mind trying to comprehend what had just transpired, the air hostess stood motionless, the badge still in her line of sight. All of her statements, presumptions, and judgment suddenly collapsed. She had tried to degrade him in front of everyone by accusing him and passing judgment on him. Now, however, she understood her mistake. The black man remained silent. He didn't have to. It was immediately apparent that he was more than just a passenger because his badge spoke for him. He had the power and the right to go anywhere he wanted to be. He was a man on a mission. The once self-assured flight hostess now faced the consequences of her own error. Like a dense cloud, the weight of the moment descended upon the cabin. After being tense during the altercation, the passengers appeared to release their anxiety by exhaling as a group. While some of them looked at each other, others fixed their gazes on the air hostess, who was still taking in the information. But the black man did not panic. His eyes slightly softened, but he remained silent. He just waited for the air hostess to take in the fact that he had delivered his point. The weight of what had just been disclosed made the moment linger in the air. The air hostess lowered her eyes slowly, her face white with shame. She was at a loss for words. How might she express regret for her actions? How could she retract what she had said? There was no turning back now that the truth had been revealed. The black man reached inside his jacket pocket with methodical, slow movements, maintaining his composed manner. Still standing in front of him, the air hostess was tight, her posture rigid with a mix of incredulity and defiance. She had been so confident that she knew this man wasn't fit for first class. However, things started to change when he gradually took a tiny, basic badge out of his pocket. With a steady gaze and a forceful yet calm voice, he held up the badge for her to see and said, "I'm here on official business." The weight of authority was carried by the words as they struck the air like an unexpected blast of wind. Despite being professional and unadorned, the emblem was easily recognizable. The words FBI Special Agent were prominently displayed, shattering the presumptions that had been formed just a moment before. Breath trapped in the air hostess's throat. Her face was losing color as her gaze fixed itself on the badge. She appeared to stumble for the first time, her self-assured facade crumbling as the reality set in. Not just any passenger, though, was the man she had so viciously criticized, the one she had accused of being out of place. He was an FBI agent on official business. As the reality came to light, the passengers who had been observing in tight quiet suddenly appeared to hold their breath. As the realization dawned, gasps echoed throughout the cabin. The black guy was more than just another first-class traveler. He was a person with authority, power, and a mission that went far beyond seat assignments and poor decisions. The air hostess was taken aback by the revelation and stood motionless for a time, opening and closing her mouth to take in what she had just heard. How could she have made such a mistake? What could have caused her to make such a grave error? All at once, she felt the consequences of her acts, and the conceit that had driven her behavior started to erode. But the black man stayed calm, his eyes unwavering but steady. There was no need for him to elaborate. His badge did the talking. He didn't have to defend his position or explain why he was in first class. What mattered was that he was here on official business. Still calm, but with a quiet authority, he added, "I trust you'll understand the situation now." After blushing with humiliation, the air hostess was unable to meet his eyes and eventually lowered her gaze. She appeared to be troubled by the knowledge of her error and the extent of her prejudice. After assuming, criticizing, and treating him disrespectfully, she discovered that he was much more significant than she had ever thought. There was a change, yet the cabin was still quiet, the tension still present. The passengers, who had been uneasy about the confrontation, appeared to calm down now that their long-held breath had finally been released. The air hostess was forced to face her own behavior after the black man's composure won the moment, revealing that she had just made a serious mistake in judgment. The air hostess's entire world seemed to fall apart as the black man coolly withdrew his FBI badge and said, "I'm here on official business." The smug look that had been on her face just a few moments before vanished in an instant, and her assured stance trembled. She gazed at the badge in his palm with wide eyes and a slightly open lips. As the truth of the situation set in, her face became a shade whiter, the color fading from her complexion. She hadn't even entertained the idea that this man might be significant because she was so confident in her judgment that she didn't think he belonged in first class, a person with power, someone who was entitled to be at his particular location. She stood motionless for a few seconds, her mind rushing to take in the reality. A strong sense of humiliation had taken the place of the haughtiness that had motivated her previous behavior. She strained to find the right words to answer, but none came as her breath stuck in her throat. Sensing the abrupt change in the mood, the passengers observed in startled stillness. As the air hostess stood there, speechless, her face displaying her amazement and humiliation, the tension in the cabin that had been so heavy only seconds before felt almost oppressive. But the black man stayed calm, his eyes unblinking and steady. Now that he had made his point, he only waited for the air hostess to come to terms with the truth of what had just been exposed. Her astonished response stood in stark contrast to his composed manner, and it was evident that the roles had been reversed in a manner she had never expected. At last, unable to look him in the eyes, the air hostess lowered her gaze. She could feel the other passengers' eyes on her, and the weight of her error was pressing down on her. She had disregarded him, accused him, and passed judgment on him, all on the basis of presumptions that were now totally disproved. Her still pale face appeared to convey the knowledge of how mistaken she had been. She was left to deal with the fallout from her actions in the most degrading manner imaginable, and the conceit that had initially motivated her to create such a public spectacle now seemed like a heavy load. There was a heavy hush in the cabin as the realization took hold. With a mixture of surprise, uneasiness, and incredulity on their faces, the passengers, who had been observing the exchange with increasing tension, suddenly responded in different ways. Eyes darted between the black man and the air hostess as a few passengers exchanged fast, anxious glances. They all seemed to have been holding their breath in anticipation of something to diffuse the tension. Now that his FBI badge had been made public, the flight hostess's previous actions looked not only improper, but also quite unnerving. Some of the passengers shuffled uneasily in their chairs, obviously uncomfortable with what they had just seen. An almost silent sigh of relief came from a man seated a few rows back. He had been observing the altercation, uncertain of how it would conclude, and now that the truth was out, he appeared to calm down, but the discomfort was still visible in his eyes. His expression was a mix of disbelief and disappointment as he looked at the air hostess as though he was perplexed by how someone could be so quick to pass judgment. A woman who had been silently watching the scene from her seat beside the aisle gave a small shake of her head, her face showing a look of incredulity. Having witnessed the air hostess's contemptuous behavior toward the black man, she was deeply ashamed of the woman who had behaved so haughtily. This feeling was heightened when she saw the badge. She and her buddy looked at one another, her lips pressed into a thin line as she acknowledged the evil that had just been done. A pair of younger passengers were whispering to one another as they leaned in toward each other in the back of the plane. They were obviously affected by what had transpired, as evidenced by their shocked and uneasy looks. A young woman gazed at the air hostess with a mixture of sympathy and contempt, and a male shook his head incredulously. Now that the truth was out, they couldn't help but feel bad for the black man who had been unfairly singled out because they had witnessed the animosity and the prejudice. A lady seated close by, who had been holding her child close throughout the altercation, now sighed softly, almost silently. "That wasn't right," she muttered softly as she glanced down at her toddler, who was observing the spectacle with wide, naive eyes. Despite the quietness of her voice, it was obviously disapproving. She had seen the injustice, and even though she had kept quiet about it, now that the truth was out, she was unable to conceal her uneasiness. The only person who stayed motionless and unable to look at anyone was the flight hostess, who was still pale and in shock. Although there was a general feeling of dread in the air, the passengers, who had been uneasy about the scenario from the beginning, now appeared to focus on other things. All of them had witnessed the bias, the presumptions, and the results of acting upon them. Now that the man's true identity had been revealed, the moment lingered, allowing everyone to consider what had just happened. Shock echoed through the cabin like a wave as the realization of the black man's identity struck in. The passengers who had been holding their breath now let out a sigh of surprise and amazement, their voices low but full of admiration. With a hint of surprise in her voice, a woman muttered to her seatmate, "I can't believe that just happened." Still taking in the scene, her gaze continued flitting between the black man and the flight hostess. She was shocked to learn that the man was an FBI agent, and she couldn't understand how the flight hostess could have been so mistaken. Sitting close to the front, a man who had been observing the entire interaction with increasing unease pushed in toward his companion. He whispered to himself, "Did she really just do that?" She didn't know to whom she was speaking. The shock of the event was still audible in his voice, which had a tone of amazement mixed with frustration. An older woman with wide eyes and a tight grip on her pocketbook was seated a few seats distant. "That was just unbelievable," she moved toward her spouse and said. "She treated him so badly. And now this." Her voice trailed off a little, as though she was having trouble putting her skepticism into words. She was deeply affected by the realization, and she was unable to get rid of the lingering uneasiness. A few travelers exchanged uncomfortable glances, their expressions expressing a common apprehension. After seeing the air hostess's handling of the black man, they were all overcome with a mixture of sadness and guilt at the revelation of the reality. Many had remained mute throughout the altercation because they were unsure of how to respond. But now that the man's genuine name was known, tension was high. A young man who had remained silent during the event suddenly sat back in his chair and shook his head in shock. He said to the woman seated behind him, "I can't believe she treated him like that, and she now has to deal with the fact that she made a huge mistake." There was sympathy for the black man in his words, but there was also a tinge of sympathy for the air hostess, who was now standing there, humiliated and exposed. As each traveler processed the scenario in their own manner, the shock-related whispers persisted throughout the cabin. Others were merely stunned into silence, while others were still attempting to comprehend what had just happened. The flight's once vibrant atmosphere had now changed, giving way to an uncomfortably quiet silence that pervaded the atmosphere. The flight hostess remained motionless in the middle of it all, her world falling apart around her, still pale and unable to speak. The passengers' muttering only served to remind her of the seriousness of her actions. She had made a mistake, one that could not be undone now. There was no avoiding the consequences now that the truth had been exposed. A little voice broke the tension as the shock-related muttering echoed through the cabin. A youngster, about 7 or 8 years old, gazed up at their mother, their eyes wide with interest. "Is he a hero?" they inquired in a quiet but distinct voice, with the innocence that only a child could have. For a time, the straightforward but deep question lingered in the air. The toddler had just witnessed the man's composed, polite response and the ensuing respect, not the complexity of the situation. For them, the black guy was more than simply someone who had been unfairly accused. He was someone who had taken a stand, maintained his composure, and spoken the truth when it was most needed. The cabin was filled with admiration at the question. A few of the people who had been observing the spectacle now gave subtle nods, their faces relaxing. Even in the face of contempt, the man had handled the dispute with such dignity and grace that it was difficult not to perceive him in a different light. He felt like a hero to many of them because of his silent strength in the face of discrimination. At the child's inquiry, an elderly traveler who had been observing the conversation intently gave a slight smile. With a tone of calm respect, they whispered to themselves, "I think he might be." Though not specifically addressed to anyone, the comments were sufficient to express admiration for the individual who had not been affected by the experience. The shift in the cabin was unnoticed by the air hostess, who was still standing motionless. She failed to notice the shift in the passengers' responses because she was too preoccupied with her own embarrassment. For everyone else in the cabin, however, the man had transcended his role as a mere traveler and had instead come to represent honor, fortitude, and silent fortitude in the face of hardship. The passengers' collective realization of the reality was triggered by the child's innocent question. The man had demonstrated what it meant to stand up, to maintain composure, and to reveal the truth in the most unexpected manner. He was no longer merely a victim of prejudice, and in doing so, he had gained the silent but potent admiration of those who had been there. Once tense and uncomfortable, the cabin now seemed to move just a little bit. The child's simple inquiry had brought the group's regard for the man into stark relief, replacing the air hostess's previous haughtiness. The air hostess, still standing in the aisle, appeared to awaken from her reverie as the cabin echoed with awe. She now felt the full force of the situation and recognized the seriousness of what she had done. The child's naive inquiry and the passenger's silent admiration for the black man helped her realize how far she had gone. She took a tentative step toward him, her face still pale but flushed with shame. Her former self-assurance had disappeared, to be replaced with a profound sense of remorse and sorrow. She opened her mouth, but as though she were trying to figure out how to make amends, the words appeared to become lodged in her throat. After a lengthy silence, she finally said, her voice wavering a little. With sad eyes, she continued, I'm so sorry. I never ought to have handled you in that manner. I truly regret that. It was wrong. The remarks were serious, but they seemed weighty. Still calm, the black man could hear the sincere regret in her voice. His expression was calm, yet understanding as he nodded slowly. He didn't react angrily or resentfully. Instead, he accepted her apologies as though he had already forgiven her and understood that her acts had been the result of ignorance rather than malice. Standing in front of him, the air hostess appeared to sag beneath the weight of her error. Now that she was confronted with the truth of her conduct, she could only apologize for the preconceptions, judgments, and actions she had made. Even though it was a little gesture, it was all she could do at the time. The passengers around them were silent, some silently applauding the exchange, while others were still taking it all in. Although there was still some tension in the cabin, there was a slight change, a feeling that the air hostess had begun to own up to her error. It was a beginning, but it wasn't enough to repair the harm. There was a pause, and then the black man spoke, his voice firm and calm. "Thank you," was all he said. "Thank you for apologizing." Although the sting of her actions persisted, the air hostess appeared to relax a little after saying those words, her shoulders falling as though a tremendous weight had been removed. She nodded slightly and respectfully, then took a step back to let things calm down. The atmosphere had changed, yet the cabin was still silent for a minute longer. After the flight hostess apologized, the black man graciously accepted her apology, even though it was a modest and discreet solution to a difficult and uncomfortable circumstance. It was sufficient to start mending the divide that had been formed. Standing in front of the black man, the air hostess's face was flushed with shame and remorse. She was having trouble finding the perfect words, and her hands were shaking a little. The reality of her own prejudice and the weight of the situation weighed heavy on her shoulders. Because she had behaved impulsively and let her presumptions guide her actions, she was now unable to ignore the reality when confronted with the repercussions. Her voice was unsteady as she mumbled, I'm so sorry. I ought not to have handled you that way. I allowed my own bias to get in the way. I didn't mean to do it, and it was wrong. She struggled to think clearly as she spoke, but the truth of what she had done seemed to paralyze her. The reality was now evident. She had only evaluated him on the basis of his appearance. No apology could make up for the disrespect she had shown him. She had to try, though. She had to own up to her error. Her voice was suddenly quieter and tinged with remorse as she continued, I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. I regret the way I behaved. You weren't worthy of that. Shame and regret were mixed together on the air hostess's face. She hadn't even entertained the idea that she might be mistaken, because she was so certain of herself and her superiority. But now that she was in front of him, she realized her mistakes. She came to the realization that her actions were motivated by prejudice rather than being merely impolite, and she could never justify them. The black man looked at her, still cool and collected. There was only a silent comprehension in his eyes, not wrath. He could see that she was truly struggling with her actions, but he had already moved on from the situation. Without saying anything, he acknowledged her apologies with a quiet nod. Still shaky a little, the air hostess inhaled deeply. Even though she had spoken what had to be said, she was still feeling the weight of the situation. She was now dealing with the repercussions of her actions, which were motivated by ignorance. She was aware that merely apologizing was insufficient. However, it was a beginning. The passengers watched the interaction with a mix of quiet approval and interest, and the cabin remained silent. Despite its flaws, the flight hostess's halting apology was a step in the right direction. Even though the harm had already been done, she seemed to be starting to realize the full price of her prejudice at this precise moment. After listening to the flight hostess's halting apologies, the black man maintained his composure and his serious look. He had already taken in the stress of the situation and realized that her remarks were genuine despite their hesitancy. He was aware that she had acted based on presumptions, but now that the truth was out, it was time to react. Not angrily, but sensibly. After taking a deep breath, he spoke in a calm, steady voice that exuded quiet authority. "I understand," he answered in a forceful but composed tone. "Everybody has prejudices, some of which they are unaware of. However, it's critical to identify them when they appear and to ensure that we don't allow them to dictate how we behave." The simple yet impactful words lingered in the air. Although he wasn't condoning her actions, he was providing an opportunity for development and a reminder that everyone could improve. "I've seen it before," he added, maintaining a steady look. "Without knowing the whole situation, people frequently make snap judgments based just on appearances. However, each of us may help change that." Though they weren't harsh, his comments had a weight that caused the air hostess to stop and think. Now that she had the facts in front of her, she understood how mistaken she had been to presume she knew who he was based only on his appearance. The man's subsequent remarks were kind but definitive. "I don't blame you for it. However, I hope this serves as a reminder to exercise caution when making assumptions about other people, as they may inflict harm that we are unaware of." The flight hostess nodded slowly, her eyes sunk in silent contemplation. His remarks had moved her, and she was aware that her apologies would not resolve the issue. It was a start, an opportunity to evolve, to become more conscious of the consequences of her choices. The passengers were taking in the moment as the cabin stayed motionless. The black man's voice was devoid of resentment and hostility. He had made the decision to reply politely, imparting wisdom and kindness. As the air hostess stood there, her apology accepted, but the consequences of her actions still weighing heavily. The tension that had earlier pervaded the air was replaced with a quiet sense of respect. Still cool and collected, the black man looked first at the flight hostess and then at the other passengers. There was a lot of tension in the cabin, but he realized that this might be more than an apology. It could be a lesson for everyone. He stepped forward, speaking steadily and clearly to the entire cabin, not just the air hostess. His comments, "Respect should never depend on appearance or assumptions," were simple but impactful. Everyone is here for a reason. Everybody has a backstory and a purpose for where they are. And none of that should be evaluated by our appearance, our background, or our apparent personalities. The air hostess, who was still standing close by, gazed at the ground with a thoughtful expression on her face. The passengers also appeared to lean in and pay close attention to what the man was saying. His voice was forceful, yet it was devoid of wrath, filled instead with a quiet wisdom that seemed to permeate the entire cabin. He went on, looking at each passenger, "We are all more than the labels others place on us. I am just like everyone else here. Each of us has specific tasks, responsibilities, and duties. and regardless of our outward appearance, we all deserve to be treated with respect. For a minute, his words lingered in the air, creating an almost reverent quiet. The cabin, which had before been tense and judgmental, suddenly appeared to hold its breath as everyone took in the man's statement. The black man waited for his message to fully register before continuing, this time nodding slightly to the air hostess. Mistakes are inevitable for everyone. Everybody has times when they feel weak. However, our actions after that define who we are. We possess the ability to adapt, grow, and improve. Still silent, the air hostess nodded slowly, her eyes meeting his with a fresh sense of deference. The tension in the cabin seemed to slightly lessen as the passengers also appeared to take in what he had to say. With a calm yet determined tone, he concluded, "We're all here for a purpose. And that goal is to treat one another with the decency that we all merit." His words continued to reverberate throughout the cabin as he sat back in his chair. The air hostess appeared to stand a little taller, her shoulders no longer stooped with shame, but with the realization of the lesson she had just learned, even though she was still processing the gravity of the situation. The tone had changed to one of quiet understanding as the passengers appeared to consider what he had said. In addition to speaking to the air hostess, the black guy had reminded everyone on board of the value of respect, which goes beyond outward looks, preconceptions, and bias. And by doing this, he had given everyone who had seen it a chance to grow out of an awkward circumstance. A silence descended upon the cabin as the black man concluded his statement. Every passenger's thoughts were affected by the words he had spoken, which hung in the air. For everyone there, what had started out as an awkward and difficult circumstance had changed into a time for silent contemplation. Some of the passengers looked at each other, their expressions contemplative, as though the man's remarks had caused them to reconsider their viewpoint. After witnessing the unease, discrimination, and tension, they were left with a more potent reminder of the value of respect and the ease with which presumptions may impair our judgment. A woman seated close to the front of the cabin appeared to be pondering the man's statements as she gazed down at her hands. She had felt uneasy after witnessing the air hostess's treatment of him and the subtle judgment in her behavior. But after listening to the man talk, she became aware of how frequently she had made snap judgments based only on appearances. Although she didn't intend to, she did pass judgment. She was deeply struck by the insight and silently vowed to improve and recognize people for who they really were rather than simply how they appeared. An older man nearby, who had been silently watching the conversation, sighed softly. He had witnessed the ugly side of prejudice and how it may affect people's lives during his long life. However, the black man's composed remarks about dignity and respect caused him to reflect on his own history and instances in which he had allowed prejudices to shape his behavior. Although he had always taken pride in being fair, he became aware that even he had been influenced by presumptions at that precise time. In silent agreement with the man's message, he gave himself a nod. Change could always be made at any time. A few rows back, a younger couple looked at each other, their eyes wide with adoration and amazement. They had been taken aback by the air hostess's actions, but after listening to the man speak with such dignity and grace, they understood that true strength was about maintaining composure in the face of difficulty rather than being pushy or noisy. They both solemnly decided that they would remember the lesson and treat everyone with dignity, regardless of their origins or identity. Still wide-eyed, but now with an understanding expression, the child who had questioned whether the man was a hero sat calmly. For them, the man was a hero because he demonstrated the strength of dignity in the face of contempt, not because he made a spectacular gesture. They now realized that a hero was someone who stood by their convictions and showed generosity to others, even when it wasn't easy, rather than just someone who rescued the day, as the child's naive query had inspired. A few paces away, the air hostess was still absorbing the gravity of the situation. Although she had expressed regret, the man's words had a profound effect on her, now that the passengers were looking on. She realized how important it was to not only apologize, but also to grow from her mistakes. Although she couldn't change the past, she could try to improve and give everyone the respect they merited. The mood had changed in the cabin. For everyone involved, what had begun as a difficult, uncomfortable scenario had transformed into a peaceful time of reflection. The black man's remarks had struck a deep chord with them all, serving as a reminder that respect should be freely granted to everyone, regardless of identity, and should not be earned based on one's status or appearance. The passengers sat in contemplative stillness as the trip went on, each one of them bearing a fresh insight. The lesson had been conveyed with composure and quiet dignity rather than with rage or confrontation, and it appeared that everyone on board had gained knowledge in that instant, a reminder that, whatever our outward appearance, we are all deserving of respect. Subtle but distinct, a wave of self-awareness swept through the cabin. As they pondered the impactful lesson they had just witnessed, people started to move in their seats one by one. Some nodded thoughtfully, while others stared out the window. A silent understanding that seemed to unite them all in that instant had taken the place of the tension that had before pervaded the atmosphere. The first to nod was the older man, who had been thinking about his own prejudices. Despite being slow and deliberate, the gesture conveyed a lot of information. He glanced at the other travelers, taking note of the minute changes in their faces. It was obvious that the black man's comments had reached them as well as he had. He experienced a feeling of unity, a mutual understanding of the exposed truth. He gave another nod, this time with a silent sense of accomplishment. A woman sitting nearby straightened her posture after feeling uneasy about the flight hostess's actions. She was looking straight ahead, but her thoughts were obviously elsewhere, considering how important it is to see people for who they really are. She had participated in the implicit judgments that frequently pervaded society, but suddenly she sensed a change in herself. She nodded slightly, seemingly resolving to be more conscious and treat everyone with the decency they merited. The younger pair looked at one another for a moment, their eyes locking in a mutual understanding. The way the flight hostess treated the black guy had shocked them, but now they understood the lesson he was trying to convey. Both of them nodded, accepting in silence that what he had spoken was true. They realized now that respect was something that should be freely given without reservation, and could not be earned or taken for granted. The child, still seated with wide eyes, gazed up at their parent in silent awe. They still wondered if the black man was a hero, but they now realized that there were different kinds of heroism. Standing up for what was right, despite discrimination, was more important than making big gestures or rescuing the day. Slowly, as though taking in the lesson in its most basic form, the toddler nodded. The flight hostess also stood quietly, her eyes downcast, as she took in the gravity of the situation. She had expressed regret, but after seeing how the other passengers responded to her acts, she realized that her actions had affected many more people than just the man she had offended. She sensed the change in the atmosphere, the faint but indisputable wave of self-awareness that was sweeping through the passengers. She had gained knowledge, but they had gained knowledge as well. A subtle yet significant change in the cabin's atmosphere occurred as the minutes went by and the awareness ripple kept spreading. Once separated by presumptions and opinions, the passengers now had a moment of comprehension. Many of them acknowledged silently that the black man's words had resonated with them by nodding in agreement. Even though they didn't say anything out loud, their mutual understanding of the value of dignity, respect, and the necessity of confronting unconscious prejudices was evident. The flight then evolved into something more than a simple means of transportation. It turned into a lesson and a turning point for everyone on board, serving as a reminder that everyone deserves respect, regardless of their identity, and that respect should never be predicated on looks or presumptions. Once standing with a faint sense of superiority, the air hostess now appeared to sag under the weight of her own image. She kept thinking about what the black man had said, and she started to realize what she had done. She felt vulnerable and raw because of the cool-headed way he had handled her prejudice, as though the same presumptions she had formed about him had been dispelled. Her once arrogant and stiff posture relaxed. With the weight of the moment pressing down on her, she stood still, her gaze fixated on the ground. She had always taken pleasure in her professionalism and her ability to treat passengers with decency and respect, but she suddenly realized how quickly her prejudices had taken over. She had let her presumptions rule her decisions and direct her behavior toward a person who had done nothing to merit her treatment. She became aware for the first time how hastily she had written the black man off because of his appearance. She had believed that he wasn't the kind of person who could afford a first-class ticket and that he didn't belong there. She had treated him with contempt because of her preconceived notions about him, not because of anything he had done. Now that the truth was out, she realized how mistaken she had been. Previously silent and uncomfortable, the passengers appeared to be watching her with a mixture of hushed judgment and fascination. She sensed that they were watching her, some with sympathy and others with dismay. The fact that she had fallen short of the expectations she had set for herself, however, was what hurt more than their criticism. Instead of treating the black guy with the respect he deserved from the start, she had been the one to behave based on presumptions and let prejudice to creep in. The soft hum of the aircraft, the reminder that the journey was still underway due to the sound of the engines, broke her reverie. Time seemed to slow down for her, though. She had gained a difficult lesson in humility and self-awareness, and she was no longer only an air hostess pouring beverages and making sure everyone was comfortable. Her chest slowly rose and fell as she inhaled deeply. Her earlier apology had been heartfelt, but it didn't feel complete. She had expressed regret for what she had done, but she now realized that real change came from altering her perspective on the world rather than merely speaking the words. She was aware that merely apologizing was insufficient. She also needed to improve herself, do better, and consciously work to overcome her own prejudices going forward. The flight hostess raised her head and once again met the black man's eyes. Both in his words and his deeds, he had exuded such nobility and grace. He had allowed her room to grow, to think, to learn. She was grateful to him even though she was feeling the weight of her own mistakes at the time. He had demonstrated to her that there was always time to grow, learn, and become more conscious of the impact her actions had on other people. The flight hostess straightened up and gave herself one more silent nod. Although she was unsure of what lay ahead, she was certain that she would approach her career and relationships with others in a different way going forward. Although it didn't happen right away, the change had already started. In the cabin's silence, she made a silent commitment to improve and make respect her first instinct, regardless of the person in front of her. The passengers appeared to notice her change as they continued to take in the scene. She no longer exuded a sense of superiority, but rather a calm humility that came from realizing the lesson she had learned. The tension in the cabin seemed to have subsided, as though the air hostess's metamorphosis had relieved the burden of the circumstance for all passengers. As the flight hostess stood there, processing the full impact of the encounter, her hands trembled a little. She was suddenly struck down by the knowledge of what she had done, the preconceptions she had allowed to influence her behavior, and the assumptions she had made. Her previously calm and assured countenance was now clearly upset, with a mixture of self-awareness and regret etched on it. She silently promised herself that very moment as the airplane's soft hum filled the cabin. She would never again act based on presumptions. She would show each passenger the respect they merited, regardless of their origin or looks. She had been extremely affected by the black man's remarks on respect, dignity, and the value of recognizing people for who they really are, and she realized that she could no longer afford to allow prejudice to influence her decisions. She looked around at the people and gulped hard, her throat constricted with emotion. She sensed that they were watching her, some with empathy and others with dismay. She did not, however, avert their eyes. She was aware that she needed to own up to the reality of what she had done, own up to her error, and take responsibility for it. She spoke, partly to herself but loud enough for others to hear, in a steadier but softer voice now. "I swear to treat everyone with the respect they deserve." I refuse to let presumptions to influence my decision-making once more, regardless of their identity or origin. Despite their simplicity, the words were powerful. Although she was clearly upset by the experience and the knowledge that she had been the one to reinforce a negative stereotype, her tone betrayed a feeling of resolution. She was aware that this was only the start of a lengthy journey that would necessitate ongoing introspection and personal development. However, she was deeply obligated to change for the first time, not only for herself, but also for the passengers she serviced on a daily basis. Her pledge hung in the air as she stood there, not just as a silent declaration to the other passengers, but also as a commitment to herself. From that point on, it was more than just doing her work. It was about being better, doing better, and making sure that respect was the foundation of all of her interactions.